So last week we started a series called Like Jesus, and I shared some thoughts about engaging like Jesus. And today I want to talk about making an entrance like Jesus. So we just heard Simon read about two different entrances that Jesus made. One was Palm Sunday. That's what we're generally celebrating today as Jesus makes his triumphant entrance as the king into Jerusalem. And he came in humility in a different way, and we'll get to that in a second. And then the second entrance, which we don't usually talk about on Palm Sunday, is his entrance into the temple. And that time when he entered, he was angry. And I want to talk about the connection between humility and anger this morning, and see where that takes us. So when sociologists study a thing like humility, they generally try to come up with, they break it all down and come up with definitions and components of the thing that they're studying. So I was taking a look at the different components that sociologists have found with humility, and I wanted to kind of overlay that on the picture of Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a colt. So the first component of humility is an openness to new ideas. Now, Jesus wasn't just open to new ideas, he was the definition of a new idea, right? He brought new ideas, he created new ideas, he spoke reality from nothing. And so he embodies this really well. But even how he came into Jerusalem. Generally, when a king would come into Jerusalem or any other conquered city, they would come on a big horse. And they would come with a lot of pomp and circumstance. They would come with sometimes music, but definitely a show of military power and strength. And some historians believe that around the time of Passover, because there were so many people coming in, the Romans thought this would be a really good time for a king's entrance to make sure that the people know, because Passover was a celebration of the people of Israel being set free, right? And so they wanted to make sure that the people of Israel knew that they were still a subjugated people. So they would generally do this big entrance of a king to say, hey, just so you remember, you're still under our thumb. And so they would come on a big horse. You know, the king would have all his regalia on, his crown, his sword, and everything. And people would hail the king, but it wasn't motivated by true celebration. It was motivated by fear and trembling. If we don't do a big show of, yay, the king is here, then we could be in tremble and be facing the vengeance of the king. Now, Jesus came riding in on a colt, a young horse or a young donkey that had never even been ridden. And that was small compared to how the other kings came. Jesus was making a statement of how he would rule in an upside-down way. It wasn't like an earthly king rules. He came in peace, and he came in humility. People celebrated him because he came that way, and because they honored him as a true king. In the passage that Ruth read, it says that the day before, Lazarus, he had just raised Lazarus from the dead. People were excited to hail him and welcome him. And they would have been thinking of that passage in Zechariah 9:9, which was a prophecy that said, "Rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion. Shout in triumph, daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is righteous and endowed with salvation, humble and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey." So he started off showing humility in how he was entering Jerusalem. The next component is a willingness and ability to accurately assess oneself. And now this is a challenge, I think, for most of us. We all have our blind spots. But what it is not is lowering yourself to worm status. So that's humiliation. Jesus walked humbly, but not in humiliation. He never claimed to be lower than he was. He just was who he was. He never shied away from very clearly proclaiming why he was there, to bring the good news of the gospel and freedom to the captives. He owned that. And so he embodied this component of humility in being willing to accurately assess oneself. Now, for us, that means accurately assessing ourselves in humility and strength. Not humility, in weakness and in strength, right? Because none of us are perfect. But it's not, Jesus never lowered himself. He was who he was, but he also didn't promote himself and puff himself up and demand that people worship him. He did what he did, and he healed people and set people free, and if they wanted to worship him, he received it, but he never demanded it. And that, to me, says humility. The next component is a willingness to acknowledge one's mistakes. Now, obviously, that doesn't apply to Jesus, but he was willing to own his capacity and his limitations. He entered humanity and subjugated himself to become a human. He was hungry. I'm sure he felt lonely at times. He experienced exhaustion and was tired. He needed to sleep. I think that would be pretty frustrating. I get frustrated that I need to sleep, but I'm sure, I don't know how Jesus felt about that, but he would disappear because he knew his needs and he was willing to operate in them. So he would disappear to go and recharge with the Father. I can imagine he was exhausted and peopled out often, and he would acknowledge that and go and spend time recharging with his Father. So there's a willingness to do that. Am I willing to acknowledge my capacity? I know when things get busy, I don't often take the time that I need and withdraw and recharge. I work harder. And I think there's something for me to learn from how Jesus lived that part of humility out. I also struggle with defensiveness, and I want to control the narrative of how others think of me when I do make a mistake. So Jesus teaches me a new way. The next component of humility is a low level of self-focus, being able to be unselfish and others-oriented. Jesus obviously lived that. He embodied that component. He spent himself on compassion everywhere he went. The day before he came into Jerusalem, he rose Lazarus from the dead. On the way into Jerusalem, in another account, he heals 2 blind men. In another account of this story, he stops outside of Jerusalem and takes a look and just takes a minute and grieves. He's so moved with compassion for the people that he knew were about to reject him. So he embodied this low level of self-focus, this self-giving love. Now, in our culture, I think we do this big pendulum swing from like too much self-focus and self-involvement all the way over here to self-hatred. And that could look like just not taking care of yourself, running yourself into the ground, to hurting yourself, right? We have this big extreme in our culture. Here's what Paul said to Timothy. He said, "Realize this, in the last days, difficult times will come." And there's this big, long list of people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, slanderers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control, brutal, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, conceited. I need to take another breath there. Lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to a form of godliness, although they've denied its power. Avoid such people as these. That's a huge list, right? And kind of discouraging. And yet, I see a lot of this in our culture today, especially when it comes to self-focus. In North America, we've never had such a crisis of self-esteem amongst our young people as we do right now. And I think the world's way of thinking about improving self-esteem or confidence is to look at yourself, to work on yourself, and to spend a lot of time focusing on yourself. And I actually think that makes it worse. The most confident, secure people that I know are also the most self-giving. Now, I think that kingdom principle of upside-down thinking applies here. That if we are busy about the work of love, then we don't have a lot of time for getting all caught up in our selfish endeavors. I'm not saying not to take care of ourselves. Jesus did that. He modeled that for us. But I think when it comes to like this constant need to be an influencer or be out there controlling people's perceptions, it's not helpful for our self-confidence and for humility. It actually works against us. So the last part of humility is kind of a combination of three things. It's an ability to celebrate others' success, to affiliate with others, and to express gratitude towards each other. So Jesus obviously embodied this really well. He was the ultimate lover of the marginalized. Even though he was sinless and he was holy, he didn't lord it over others or walk around like he was holier than thou, unapproachable. He was so approachable. People in the margins flocked to him. They loved to be around him. They felt seen and heard by him. And I think it's a good reflection sometimes to ask myself and to ask the people that are very close to me is, how do you feel when you spend time with me? Are you feeling seen? Are you feeling heard? Or am I causing you anxiety? Do you feel like a check mark on my list? We want to be people who are accessible and affiliate ourselves with others, especially if they're different than us. I know that is hard. It is hard to come alongside people who are very different, and yet it is the very thing that Jesus did and modeled for us. Can we celebrate each other's successes and cheer each other on? And we saw Jesus constantly expressing gratitude to the Father. And I think gratitude as a practice could be 10 other messages for sure. But it is a big part of humility. So now let's take a look at anger. So that was kind of embodying how Jesus came into Jerusalem. Now let's look at that second entrance of him coming into the temple. And to understand that, I want us to understand what anger is like. So it is a basic human emotion, and it is tied to survival and relationships. It's all about that fight, flight, or freeze, and it is as core to our human experiences as joy or disgust or sadness or fear. How many of you have watched Inside Out? 3. So worth the watch to learn brain science. It's really interesting. Anger is one of my favorite little guys on that show. But anger, I love this saying, this quote that I came across this week. Anger is like a child. You don't want to let it drive the car, and you certainly do not want to stuff it in the trunk. And I think sometimes anger can definitely be expressed in different ways, right? Some people are out there and they let anger run the show, drive the car. And other people prefer to stuff anger in the trunk, repress it, and hold it in. And either way, science has shown that repressed anger and expressed anger actually is one of the leading causes of heart disease. So it has effects on you whether you're expressing it or repressing it. It also affects your relationships, and we'll get there in a minute. So the neuroscience of anger, the limbic system, or the part of your survival brain, when you are angry, it fires off all these chemicals in your brain, and I'll list them, although I don't know how many of you are neuroscientists, but catecholamine, adrenaline, we've probably all heard of that one, epinephrine and norepinephrine. And what that means is it gives you energy. So when you're angry, it pumps energy into your body. We're only meant to hold these kind of emotions for short periods of time, though. So that's why it can cause a lot of heart disease. If we hold this on, these chemicals are not great to be floating around in our bodies for long periods of time. But it gives energy and it demands action. it can be addictive. Those same chemicals are the same chemicals that are initiated when we take a stimulant, like caffeine or cocaine. Hate to tell you, but those are in the same family. Or methamphetamines. They initiate energy. They give a big push of energy. So it can be addictive. Anger can be addictive. And it can be destructive. So here I'm going to share a part of my own journey with anger, which is not fun to share, but I think is important to share because we all struggle with different forms of this. But when I was an angry mom, not always, I was also a great mom. But I did have pretty regular flare-ups. I was really surprised by that, actually, because I had this idea of what I was going to be like when I was a mom. And when I'd go to the grocery store and I'd see moms yelling at their kids, I would be like, I'm not going to be like that. And then I was. And I hated it. I couldn't seem to have any self-control about it when it happened. I would be yelling at a toddler sometimes, hearing the words coming out of my mouth and feeling like I had no control, feeling like I was a toddler myself. And knowing that what I was saying was not true or appropriate. I'm sure Simon was as shocked as me at what was coming out of me sometimes. He gave me a timeout one time. Sent me to my room, which was good. But I was really upset about that part of me, and I didn't know where it was coming from or how to change it. I would read books. I would pray. I would pray. I would beg God, please take this away from me. And it didn't happen like that. He didn't miraculously deliver me from these fits of anger that I was having. But he sent me to school. Now, I wasn't keen on going back to school when I was almost 40, but I needed to be there, and I needed to learn what I learned about my brain and about all these things and about why I couldn't break free from this destructive cycle of anger. It was getting to the point where I was losing respect with my kids. I was hurting our relationships, especially my older kids, and I didn't want to be like that anymore, but I didn't know how to stop. And I was caught in that cycle of having a temper tantrum, feeling bad, guilty, asking for forgiveness, feeling like, okay, I'm getting on top of this, and going around again and around again. And as I was learning about how the brain works, I realized that we don't repeat behaviors that don't serve us somehow. And to me, that made no sense about my anger. How is anger serving me? I feel horrible afterwards. It's ruining relationships. And then it came to me as I did some work on my inside that I would have these little temper tantrums when I felt out of control, when I felt powerless. It was usually around the time that the kids were all coming home from school, and I had 4, and I was making supper, and there would be chaos, and maybe there was some emotional stuff that was happening with my family of origin or whatever, stress of some kind. And it was all bottling up, and then it would just explode. And so I realized that when I lost my temper, even though I felt horrible about it, for like 5 minutes, I'd feel like I could control something. I felt powerful for 5 minutes, and then I felt like garbage afterwards. But it was that 5 minutes, my brain said, you need to feel in control for 5 minutes. And so identifying that those were the places where I lost control, even though I felt like I was in control, I was able to start working with Jesus to make changes in my life that have had a lasting impact and improved my relationship with my kids and brought a lot of healing. It's not like I don't get angry anymore. I just have more tools to know what to do with it. Going for a really hard walk is helpful. Cleaning aggressively. Simon always teases me that if the house is getting too bad that we should have a fight. And that would take care of that. But God has done a lot of healing in my life around that issue, but I get it. It can be a hard thing to get on top of. So humility and anger, how do those things work together? And again, there has been a lot of science, I found out, that shows how humility impacts our experience of anger. I'm going to start at the bottom, actually, with this hot sauce experiment, which I thought was very funny and interesting. So the sociologists did this study where they asked a bunch of people if they would be involved in a study. They didn't know what the study was about, and they took half of the people and just gave them neutral words to read that had nothing to do with anything about the study, but just neutral words, sky, tree, I don't know what they said, but neutral. And then half of the group, they gave them words that would prompt feelings of humility. So maybe that list, like openness to new ideas, or others focused, or whatever. They gave them this big list of words that they just had to read. They didn't talk about it, they just read these words before the experiment started. And then they took all the people, and paired them with an actor. Now, they didn't know that it was an actor. And all these people in the experiment, I didn't set this up properly, they were all a part of a very fundamentalist religious group. Okay, so they had very, very strong religious beliefs. And the actors had been prompted the conversation was supposed to be about religion. And the actors had been prompted to somehow insult the people's beliefs. And so they would have this conversation, and the actor in the process of the conversation would insult the other person's religious beliefs. And that doesn't usually go over very well. So after the conversation was wrapped up, the actors went into this other room, into a lunchroom, and these other people were given the task to make themselves and their partner a sandwich. And they had all these condiments there, and they would make the sandwiches. They're laughing. They already know where this is going. The people who were in the humility-prompted group made the sandwiches pretty equally, and they used a little bit of hot sauce on their partner's sandwich, the person that made them mad, right? The people with the neutral words that were prompted with just neutral words piled that hot sauce on. And it was really interesting. They took vengeance on their partner who had discriminated and said something offensive to them in a way that the people that had been prompted with humility didn't. So that was a really interesting thing, I thought, that even just thinking about humility can change the responses. But the other things about the way that humility impacts our anger levels is that humility is pretty much the opposite of pride, right? So if we cultivate an attitude of humility, we're less likely to have those hot buttons pushed. Humility is associated with openness. And I don't know about you, but when I'm angry, I'm not very open to new ideas. I close myself off, and I'm right. Humility acknowledges mistakes, where anger usually makes defensive excuses. Humility is about celebrating each other, and often anger is associated with feelings of jealousy or envy. So if we cultivate humility, we are actually preventing some issues of anger that would come along. What is anger for then? Ooh. Went too far. What does the scripture say about anger? It says, "For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Be angry and do not sin." There's an acknowledgement there that we do get angry, and somehow maybe it's a way to be angry and not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, so don't hold on to it, and give no opportunity for the devil. Calm your anger and abandon wrath. Don't be angry, it only leads to evil. And then Jesus said, "You're familiar with the commands of the ancients, do not murder. I'm telling you that anyone who is so much as angry with a brother or sister is guilty of murder. And there's Jesus again, raising the bar, right? He said, the commandments were about your behavior. I'm going for your heart. I want to deal with the emotions and the attitudes that could eventually lead to murder. But he's after our hearts, our motives, our thoughts, more than just the outward behavior. So what is anger telling me? What is it useful for? It's kind of like the lights on your dashboard. I think it's something that we need to pay attention to. And I think the design of anger is to alert us when love is being violated. And it gives us energy to fight for bringing the relationships back into right standing. So how did Jesus do that? Because when he went into the temple, he was angry. Why was he angry? And how does that line up with humility? What was Jesus angry about? So in the temple courts, as I did some studying this week, I found it really interesting. This was a fairly new temple and in Jesus' time, and it was set up with different levels of outer courts. So the first outer court that Jesus would have first entered, where this thing happened, was set up to be open to any God-fearing person who wanted to come and pray, even Gentiles. Gentiles, women, children, men who were ceremonially unclean, they could all come into that outer court and come and pray and practice their faith. Then there was the women's court, that was after that, and that's where the women could come or the men that were ceremonially unclean. And then closer to the center was the men's court. And then there was the holy place and the holiest of holies where the priests would worship God. So this outer court was set aside and was accessible to people in the margins to come and worship God. Now during festivals, Jerusalem would be filled with lots of people. The population would swell and the streets were quite crowded. People were coming from all over the known world with different kinds of money, and they needed to change their monies and buy sacrifices to make at the temple. If you're coming from a long distance, you probably wouldn't want to bring your doves with you, so you would buy them when you got there. And generally, these money changers and salespeople would set up outside the temple. But I think maybe because it was so crowded during Passover season, they decided that, well, this outer court is like just for the people in the margins. They don't really need to come in and worship God. We'll set up our stuff in here. And so they had set up and taken up the space where any people who wanted to pray could come in and access space for that. They had set up and crowded out the space, the little space that there was for anybody to come and worship. It was setting up love of money over inclusion of the people. And that made Jesus angry. This was supposed to be his Father's house where people could come and pray. And he drove them out. He had no patience for it. He drove them out. In one story of recounting of this, he actually drove them out with a whip. He flipped tables and he said, "This isn't happening in my Father's house, the only place where anybody could come and pray." And as soon as he did that, as soon as he used all that energy of anger to call others towards love and clear the space, who came? The blind and the lame came to him for healing, and he started healing people. All of a sudden there was space for people to come in. So as we think about learning to love like Jesus together, I think there is a way to be angry. But it's pretty hard for us to do that in the same way that Jesus did it. The closest thing I can think of is when we see injustice and we want to make it right for others. If my kids are getting hurt and I get that mama bear feeling, That, I think, is a little taste of maybe a good kind of anger. Now, what I do with it is not always great. I need to work on that. But those self-giving, loving kind of anger that speaks up for others, invites others into the presence of God, I think that's the kind that we can practice. And it's worth a conversation and thought. As I was thinking about those two entrances, I also thought about how Jesus enters our lives. And if we've invited Jesus to come into our life and be our Lord, and said that we want to follow his way, we want to do this, then we want to take his lead. And there have been some, there's celebration, we're set free, we can rejoice in that and be confident in that and build humility around that and gratefulness. And it's like that celebration of Palm Sunday where we're welcoming Jesus in. And it's a beautiful thing. There's also another way that Jesus enters our lives, I think, which is hard. And I don't like to think about Jesus being angry. But I do want him to do his work in my life, even if that means flipping some tables in my life. There's things in my life that can crowd out the presence of God and the welcome of Jesus. I want my life to proclaim good news to everyone that I meet. And that means I have to make space for that to happen. I have to build relationships. I have to be connected to people in a way. What blocks that flow of love in my life? It could be the anger thing. There's been times when I have had unforgiveness in my life, and Jesus came in and flipped that table. He loves me so much that he accepts me. He accepts you right where you're at. You don't need to change before you come to Jesus. But he loves us too much to let us stay the same. He wants us to know a deeper and deeper love. And so if we say, yes, Lord, come into my life, and it's a party, and yay, that is amazing, and we receive all his love and blessing, I pray that we would also be able to receive the moments in our lives where Jesus wants to flip some tables in my life, where I have crowded out his presence and the presence of others who are in the margins, who need the invitation of Jesus. So let's pray. Jesus, I just want to say that I love you, and I love how you lead us. And I'm so thankful that you have entered our lives and you are calling us to be a people who are learning to love like you. We want to follow you. And I thank you for the celebration of honoring you as King of our lives. I thank you for the way that you entered Jerusalem as a humble king, bringing peace and salvation. Lord, may we follow that example of bringing your kingdom with us wherever we walk. And Lord, if there's some tables to flip, if there's ways that we crowd you out or crowd others out, Lord, would we be willing? May we be willing to work with you, to have those things driven out of our lives. Not because you're mad, but because you want the best for our lives. You want us to have abundant life and our lives to be an invitation to the gospel. So we give you our lives again and say, have your way, Lord. Come, Holy Spirit. We give you all the glory. Amen.